Thank you very much, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? All right, brilliant. So, very warm welcome to everybody who is in this session. So, as you've just been watching me for the last 45 minutes, you will know that my name is Nikki and I am an Ielts expert. So, this is really your opportunity, everybody, to ask me any questions that you might have, either about Ielts in Ielts Task 1 writing in general, or if there's anything a little bit more specific that you'd like to ask me. So if anybody has any questions, do please, you can, for example, write it into the chat, and you can also unmute yourselves. But there were a couple of self-reflection questions that were written onto the description of the workshop today. So I'll just leave a space for a moment if anybody does have a question. If not, we'll start with the self-reflection questions. I'd like to make this session as much as possible about your questions. All right, guys. Oh, okay. So if there is nothing that immediately springs into your mind, we'll have a look at the self-reflective questions. Okay. So the first question that we had on the description of the workshop was about the inclusion of irrelevant details. Okay, and the question was, they're written in the chat here. So it was, under which of the criteria would the inclusion of irrelevant details be penalized according to the banned descriptors? Okay, everyone. So I really like it if you either write some answers to this into the chat, or if you're feeling brave and confident, then you can unmute yourselves as well and say it out loud. So we're looking at the first self-reflective question. Please don't be worried about making a mistake. That's a suggestion. So which of the 4 banned descriptors? Okay, so are we talking about task achievement? Are we talking about CC, coherence and cohesion? Talking about lexis, or are we talking about grammar? So where would the inclusion of irrelevant detail be penalized? Okay, right, we've got a few answers coming in now. They're coming in thick and fast, so that's brilliant. Yes, that's it, everybody. You are absolutely right. So these would be penalized under TA, okay, task achievement. One of the points I make in the workshop is that you really do need to have a copy of the banned descriptors, okay, the public banned descriptors. Have them available to yourselves. Download them as a PDF on your phone. I've actually got them here on my iPad. They're always very close to me, even though I probably know them from memory, because this is really your roadmap. This is your key to being able to better prepare your students, having a very, very clear idea of what is expected. Okay, so you will see, if you look from bands 4 and up, they talk about irrelevant details. Okay, so this is where it would be penalized. Now, what that means is, if the candidate is penalized in, for example, TA, they are not then penalized for the same thing in the other columns, okay, in the other sections. So you can only be penalized once, effectively. Okay, this is why it's often the case that people end up with things like jagged profiles, which is where you can have very, very different results. Because, for example, if somebody committed a sort of fatal error, so if we look even at band 4, for example, so they don't cover all the key features or bullet points, or maybe they run out of time, they write a very, very short answer, they could end up with 8s in the other bands, and just a 4 in that first band. Okay, so this can often be one of the keys why people end up being a jagged profile. Okay, so I've just seen something here from Maria. To achieve the given time for the test. Sorry, that's the answer to number 2. Yes, excellent. Okay, so the second self-reflective question was all about time. Okay, and it is, why is it important to stick to the specified word count? Yeah, why is it important? So yeah, there are 2 reasons for this. Okay, so one of them is to achieve the given time for the test. So this is really, really important, because obviously 250 words is not a lot, okay? And if the candidate decides to start with task 2, so perhaps this is a technique, so perhaps the candidate is stronger at task 2 than task 1, so they might be encouraged to start with task 2 because it's worth a lot more marks, and maybe it will help them to build their confidence a little bit before they get into task 1. What you don't really want is somebody to start with task 1, feel very demoralized and demotivated because they feel they can't perform very well in that task, and then sort of shoot themselves in the foot, as we say, for task 2. So let's imagine they start with task 2 and they start writing. Now, 250 words is nothing really, especially to explore some of the ideas that they want you to explore in Ielts task 2. They start writing. Now, as soon as you start to go beyond 280, 290 words, you're majorly reducing the amount of time you've got to answer the other half of the test, okay? And I see Michael has just put in here the second half of the answer, which is that it opens the opportunity to make more mistakes than necessary, 100%, okay? So there are the two reasons. First of all, the more you write, the less time you have for writing the other task, and also for checking, okay? Because checking is extremely important to make sure you have time to check. They will find, candidates can always find many mistakes when they check. Secondly, anybody's gonna make more mistakes. It's just a law of averages. The more you write, the more chance you've got of making a mistake. So really, again, this is an example of kind of shooting yourself in the foot if you write too much. You don't do yourself any favors. So yes, well done to Maria and Michael there for coming up with those answers.
And Nikki, can I add the question here? Is it possible that not writing at least 150 words can it have an impact on students' band as well?
So basically, if we go back to the rubric of what is required, it says you must write 150 words. So they must write 150 words. And so the implication of that is that if they don't, then it has some sort of consequence. And the same with 250 words. And sometimes the other thing that I mentioned quite a lot in my workshop is about the need to use Ielts paper. Okay, so a little bit like the band descriptors, I have the Ielts paper here, also very close to my heart, because there is information along the bottom of this paper which also speaks volumes about what the examiners are looking for. This is publicly available paper. Not only is it useful in terms of candidates being able to measure how much they should write, just visually, but it's also useful because along the bottom you have these little mystery boxes, yes, little Pandora's boxes of information. And it says things like underlength, number of words, penalty, off topic, memorized, illegible. So if there is a specific box there where the examiner has to write how many words the candidate should write, then clearly it's important. Okay, and the examiners are counting all of the words. All right. The other box there, which is we're going to have a look at later on, but it's things like memorized. So again, clearly, if there's a box there for memorized, and you imagine it could be ticked, it's obviously going to have a really negative consequence. Yeah. So yes, look out for all the hidden hidden keys. Okay, great. And the third question, which is also going to be answered by the little boxes on the bottom, is about handwriting. Is good handwriting important? What do you think? Tell me in the chat. Michael says, I hope not. Mine looks like a tired and emotional spider staggered across the page. Oh dear. Okay, and Maria says, I have experienced some difficulties in understanding the handwriting of some students coming from some countries that use a different alphabet. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Gabby says, as long as the writing is legible, it shouldn't, right? As long as it's readable. Okay. So let's go back to our Pandora's boxes at the bottom of our writing paper, and you will see there, I'm not sure why I can't hold it up, but you will see that there is a box that says illegible. Now, this gives us, now I hope that nobody is going to have a candidate that writes illegible, okay, writes in an illegible way. If they do, then there's a lot of work that needs to be done before they go into IELTS, okay? But the fact that there's a box there that an examiner could tick should speak volumes about how important handwriting is. The long and the short of it is, yes, handwriting is important. So Michael, your spider school would need some work, yeah? And I've seen it. I've seen it many times. I've taught students. I remember I was teaching a very, very capable doctor some years ago, and couldn't read his work, and he never got more than a 6 on in his writing test, and he was undoubtedly because the examiner couldn't read his handwriting. So there's 2 reasons why handwriting is important. The first one is because if it is illegible or close to illegible, there is the potential for the examiner to tick that box, and that's big trouble. The second reason why it's important is examiners are people. So let's imagine that you're marking on a Saturday afternoon and you have to mark 20 scripts, and you're quite tired and you've probably got other things you'd rather be doing, because probably most people don't mark IELTS for the love of it. And suddenly you're faced with spider school. Sorry, Michael. You know, it's not going to be looked at favorably, okay? And they're not going to struggle. They're not going to struggle. They're going to go, they're going to read it once. Now you need to be encouraging your students to make the examiner's life easy. Don't make it difficult for the examiner, okay? Because if you do that, then it is no doubt, there's no doubt it's going to reflect badly, okay? So yeah, very, very important handwriting.
It's very interesting, Nikki. I used to have a student, a doctor, a neurosurgeon, whose handwriting was not legible. Certain letters, you know, and we really needed to work a lot on that as well. So because in my case, or in her case, it was exactly the same, that she couldn't get anything higher than 6 at the beginning. And once I spotted, you know, what the issue can be, because we teachers can get used to their handwriting easily, you know, after just seeing 1 or 2 samples of their writing, we can kind of see what is there. But exactly when examiners have, I don't know, 20, 30, or God knows how many to check, I don't think they will spend 20 seconds trying to make out what's there. So
definitely not. Yeah. And the thing is, especially if you're teaching adult learners, you know, and I have taught hundreds and hundreds of adult learners. The thing about IELTS is it's a very high stakes exam, and therefore it generally attracts people who are very professional. They have very professional jobs, and that's why they need this high stakes exam. And so so very often, for example, doctors, so neurosurgeon, yes, I've taught neurosurgeons, I've taught psychiatrists, I've taught everybody. And yeah, I've taught top heart consultants, world heart consultants. You know, and they can be very resistant to needing to make this change. And it takes quite a lot of strength of character on the part of the teacher to be able to say to them, look, Mr. Doctor, I know you've been writing like this for 40 years. I know you're the best heart surgeon in the world. But when the IELTS examiner turns over your paper, they don't know you from Adam. So it makes no difference, you know, and yes, I can get used to your writing, and yes, you can explain it to me 100 different ways, but that's the long and the short of it. And the thing is, by showing them the paper, so, you know, show them the paper, show them the box and say, look, if you do this, the examiner is going to tick the illegible box. I'm not inventing this, it's publicly available. And that could be the difference. And it will also give you a little bit of backup, you know, to be able to have that conversation. Because it really, in a lot of cases, it can be life-changing, and it can make the difference between people being able to get that medical registry, beyond that medical register or not, to emigrate to another country or not. So it's very important.
in my case, how I made herself uh, aware of her own handwriting was that I took one word from her written text and covered everything around that so that it was not in context. And I asked her to come and can you read what's written there? And she was not able to do that without recognizing her own handwriting without context. And that made her notice that, oops, and realize that I really need to change something because I'm not able to read my own handwriting.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be a real battle because people can really enter real denial. I mean, and to be honest, that's quite, in a sense, lucky that she was able to come around just with that example, because being shown back to her, because I've experienced huge resistance. I had one doctor who I think he's from the Ukraine. I'm not sure, that doesn't matter, but he basically said, well, I'm not changing my handwriting and I'm not going to do IELTS. And he completely decides to do something else, some other path. It was because he wasn't willing to change his handwriting, So yeah, it can be a battle. And we've got a participant here, Yawande, who's saying, I think most doctors have illegible handwriting. And this is, going back to what we're saying, this is a high stakes exam. Handwriting becomes extremely important at the higher bands as well, because this is where you really don't want to give the examiner any trouble. You just want them to focus on your great grammar, on your ideas, on your wonderful lexis, to be able to get 8s, for example. And that's usually what doctors and other health professionals are going for. So, and the two things are not very compatible. So this is why it was one of the self-reflection questions. Okay, so I think we're out of pre-designed questions. So it's really over to you now, attendees. I would love to answer any questions that you have. Please don't be shy.
I have a question, Nikki, until people gain confidence to come up with their own questions. We often hear students talk about the frequency of certain tasks. So they are convinced that there are certain types of tasks that are more frequent in the exam than others. So for instance, we hardly ever have any process questions, so don't even waste our time in class focusing on them. What do you think about these beliefs?
Okay, so I should probably say that I've never been involved at a sort of a IDP or British Council level of choosing tasks or the frequency of tasks, but I can certainly give you anecdotal experience from 20 years of submitting candidates for this exam. There's definitely a pattern that in the past, let's say until about 8 years ago, you didn't get process questions very often, but that changed, and now you get a lot more process, maps, diagrams than before. So I do think, and again, I have no hotline to British Council. I really don't know. This is purely anecdotal evidence, but I really do think that a decision was made within the British Council at some point in the last decade that, okay, we offer all these task types, these data types, but we're not potentially distributing them with equal frequency. We need a few more process types, maps, diagrams, and more recent IELTS course material. So one of my favorite books, which is The Complete Guide to IELTS by National Geographic, it has equal sections dedicated to the training of line graphs, the training of maps, the training of diagrams. So I think that possibly was true in the past, but it isn't true anymore. So if you get people that, students that say this, it's a myth now. Ooh, Janice has asked a very interesting question here, and it relates to another Pandora's box. Ooh.
Yeah, but basically, because I'm come from Hong Kong, as you know, and there's a lot, many, not only from China, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, these Asia country, a lot of the English training school will basically say this particular class is target to 7.5 or 8.5 IELTS score. And what they do is they go through all the previous IELTS exam paper and try to guess what are the popular topics and hoping that just train student on these topic, and then helping them to get the higher score that they're hoping for. I mean, I'm not sure if it's common in Europe, but it's very definitely very popular in Asia countries.
Yeah, this is extremely interesting, Janice. Thank you very much for raising this, because it's yeah, this is a whole point that's very, very, very interesting. So I was lucky enough to previously have a colleague who became an academic doctor of Ielts. So such a thing exists. You can be Dr. Ielts. I am not Dr. Ielts, but it is possible. And this particular academic's area of expertise, so what she did all of her thesis on, was memorization technique in Asia, I think in particular China. And now, can we, personally, I've never, ever prepared a candidate in that way, and I never would. But as I understand it, and again, I'm not an expert in this, as I understand it, it kind of depends a little bit on what kind of education you had to date. Because if I was to take, say, a European student who's probably had an educational experience up to that point, which is more based on expansion of knowledge, critical thinking, bringing in all of their own ideas, negotiating their own syllabus, that education method as an entire method is very different to perhaps a method where it's based on memorization, and potentially people have been memorizing since they were children. So they're used to memorizing. Yeah. They have the capacity to memorize huge chunks of information. I believe it's also similar also in India. This kind of education based around rote learning and memorization. Okay. So I'm not going to say I'm not going to make any comments about what I think about that as a system of education, but as I understand, that's kind of the way it's done. So for me, it would never be practical. It would take so long for me to train someone to memorize everything that it would just be a lot easier for me to just teach them to speak good English and pass the exam in the traditional for me way. However, potentially, if that's the way that you've been used to learning up to that point, and your brain is predisposed to learning in that way, it could work. There is a huge risk, though, that if the examiner thinks that the answer is memorized, and yet there are lots of examples of it, they will tick the memorized box. So at the bottom of this paper, there is a box that says memorized. And again, remember, these boxes are Pandora's boxes, and they are huge alarm bells. Yeah. They are huge insight into what examiners are looking for. And again, I can only imagine that the consequences would not be good for an answer that is memorized or obviously memorized. So, and the other thing is about memorizing writing. You can memorize writing, but you can't memorize speaking. And certainly I've seen in my teaching practice students who have been able to memorize and memorize quite effectively, and the writing's okay. And every now and again I think, and then I ask them a few questions you can't answer. So the long and the short of that is you might end up being able to memorize your way to a 6, a 6.5, maybe even a 7. But you're going to end up a jagged profile, because if your English is so poor that you need to memorize, it's going to reflect in the speaking anyway. So in the speaking, you're going to get a 4 or a 5. So overall, but hey, maybe that's all you need. Maybe you need a 5.5 overall. So if you can get a 7 in the writing and you get a 5 in the speaking, so it's strategies.
And Nikki, do you have, because I'm not a fan, to be honest, of my students memorizing answers either, because you see, you have a pie chart about food, and then you memorize your answers, and then I can give you another pie chart related to animals. So you will not really be able to use what you have memorized previously. So, but still some students, really like come to me and ask me whether I have written sentences that they can use, in their writing. And so do you, like, what do you suggest? Do you have any techniques that teachers can use to train their students out of memorizing answers?
Oof. Well,
Oh,
the opposite to memorizing is, I think Gabby has just put it here in the chat, is I guess explicit focus on critical thinking skills in the IELTS class would be helpful. Yeah. Again, if you have, if it's a longer course, you have the possibility to do this. It's almost like a kind of a rewiring process then that needs to sort of go on, because it is useful to use some formulaic language, and I think I mentioned that in my top tips at the end. So there's nothing wrong with having a few pre-prepared sentences and learning carefully how to, especially for task 1, inject the right knowledge into the right gaps and this kind of thing. And it can be psychologically a real crutch as well for the candidates when they go into the room. But yeah, if you're more in the zone of needing to teach critical thinking, that's more like an academic skills course, or so you need to be skillful and do the two things at the same time, which I've been required to do many, many times in my teaching career. And it's not easy. Yeah, it's not easy. Okay, so I believe we've got Maria with a question. So Maria, if you'd like to unmute yourself, I would really like to hear it.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Hi. I can, yes. Hi, Maria. Thank you.
Sorry, it's just that it wasn't the question as such when Gianni mentioned that the practice, what they do in China regarding written papers. I mean, I was writing it on the panelists and attendees section. It's that it's a practice, a similar practice that I've experienced in the northeast of Spain, where I was working. And I mean, it was just students previous to their university entry. They have to do an exam before they are allowed to, well, they can join university. And it was interesting that with the English section, they were all trained on how to write a letter, on how to argue, how to write, an argument, arguing about something, a topic, a description, and then a sort of for or against something, an issue. And it was interesting that when you came to correct the papers, those students who had been trained how to argue, how to write a letter, how to write a description. I mean, the structure was perfect. But then, of course, because there was a topic, the letter would have, had to be perhaps to a friend or to somebody important. Or then is when the text didn't make much sense. Because there was a lack of other elements, sometimes there was a lack of knowledge of I mean, if they were talking about perhaps child deprivation and they had to discuss on that, you could observe that they were using the example they had been given, and then they would just elaborate around that. And of course the structure would be perfect, but there was something missing there. But that was an experience I had.
Yeah, thank you, Maria, for sharing that. Yeah, it's when you see examples of memorized IELTS, or as Maria said, any type of memorized text, it is usually fairly obvious that it's been memorized, because it is very, very difficult to sustain that and over an entire extended piece of writing. And it is just very difficult for anyone, even if you've been memorizing your whole life, to just memorize that number of answers. And the thing is, IELTS is not really the IELTS is not set up. IELTS is set up for critical thinking. So if of course, I was just thinking while Maria was talking, and I was thinking, well, we have to be practical here, because for many people, perhaps the majority of people that take IELTS, it's a means to an end. They didn't want to do this exam. They have to do this exam, because if they don't, they can't move on. So, they're not even maybe that keen on English. They maybe don't even need to use their English that much. They're not people, like me. I'm a language lover. I love learning languages. I love exploring cultures, but not everybody's like that. well, I just want to carry on being a neurosurgeon, you know, and play tennis on a Saturday. So I don't, it's a means to an end. So you have to be practical. So if they want to memorize and you think, well, you know, okay, let's try to combine both. So Gabby mentioned in the chat as well about, yeah, you need to explain to them, well, yes, this is a critical thinking exam. I realize you know, the number of times I've had students say, I've given them a question and they say, I don't know. You know, they just have never thought about it and they don't care, you know, and it's quite hard to get people to think critically about topics that they've either never ever thought about or don't really care about. So it is takes quite a bit of work and quite a, you know, a lot more thinking about than obviously we've got time to really do in this session. And of course there will be another workshop about IELTS task 2. So I suppose this question will come up in more detail. Janice said I did memorize a few sentences when I took mine. Yeah, you know, I mean, you can't really blame people, you know, people just want to get on past the exam, you know, so memorizing a little bit here and there is not a huge problem. Yeah. Do we have any final questions?
I think it's students, you know, when they are especially new to IELTS and you show them a graph or chart of what they can expect in the exam, that can really freak them out. So it's they have no idea what they can write about it at all. And so how can we help them with that?
So the first thing is never ever present an IELTS task 1 graph or chart to a brand new student until they've done a lot of other types of things around it, because it will unbelievably freak them out. I mean, I sometimes still get a bit freaked out when I see them, you know, when there's a new book published, I'm like, oh, some new material. And then I pick up the book and I'm like, oh no, it's okay. I've seen these a million times. Because I'm not a numbers person, you know, I'm a words person. So, you know, it's totally, it can be really, really overwhelming. And so, okay, there's lots of things you can do. It depends on where they are at with their English language journey. One of the easiest things to do is to tell them to go away and find a few statistics about something that they like. If they're into music, could they just bring in a couple of statistics about music? Maybe they could find a little, you know, the top albums of 2020, you know, and then get them to turn it into a little pie chart. Do a little discussion in the class, like who's got some computer skills, who's got poster making skills, who's got, to make it a more sort of fun, collaborative activity where they are contributing the statistics initially. You don't have to, even at this point, again, depending on where they are on their journey, if they're brand new to IELTS, then, you know, this is great, because you don't even at that point need to tell them, well, this is because you're going to have to write about a graph. It's all just fun and collaborative at that stage. And then they, as a piece of homework, once they've done this exercise as a piece of homework, they have to write little reports, again, not worrying about IELTS language or anything like that, but just orientating them around the idea of starting to manage statistics. You could ask them to draw a map of their town, a very basic map of their town 50 years ago and their town now. So this also, if you're in an international context, I'm sure somebody's, you know, it gives them opportunities to talk about hometown, which is a topic on the speaking, so you can bring in elements of the speaking. So there's lots and lots of things you can do, and then you gradually start to move them towards seeing a real task. And the thing is at the beginning, make it very, very, very collaborative, even so the stress is kind of shared, you know, so nobody feels like they're facing this alone. And then once they have you know, feeling more and more and more and more confident, you might say, okay, no time restrictions, try one at home, you know, bring it back, do some feedback, no consequences, you know, no wooden stick, and you just kind of build it up step by step. So that's what I would, that's how I would do it if I was going from scratch. If you're not going from scratch and you get a kind of, as I like to call them, a 999 candidate, an emergency candidate who comes to you like 1 week before the exam and says, I need a 7, then unfortunately they're going to have some short, sharp shocks, and hopefully they may have already had some lessons with somebody else who's exposed them to graphs. So yeah, but a brand new class, that's the way to do it. Okay, just having a quick look at the chat here. Teaching, speaking and writing skills in the IELTS class very often means teaching students how to reason and how to think. Yeah, absolutely. 100%, which is, again, what we were kind of talking about critical thinking. And, you know, there are certainly countries where people are not encouraged to think critically at all. I'm not going to name any of them, but I've taught many people from many countries where you ask them a question and they literally have no opinion. They've never thought about it. This is hard. This is kind of getting on to like quite a different topic here. So I'm kind of going to bring it back a little bit. Yeah, so Maria says, agrees with Gabby because the context of IELTS implies the student is thinking of moving to an English-speaking country. And critical thinking strategies are essential. Yeah, I mean, this is another debate within IELTS. Is IELTS an English test or is it a critical thinking test? And again, the bottom line is, if you're going for very high bands, like 7s or 8s, which may be the real high stakes that make a difference to whether or not somebody could, for example, emigrate to another country or pick up their doctor qualifications and just come to the UK and start, or Canada or wherever, or US. Yeah, there's a huge element of critical thinking, huge.
And I think here, like, the importance of planning before writing is super important, because a lot of students get the chart or, you know, graph or process, and without thinking start writing, start working on their essay. And so if they spend 1 or 2 minutes just having a plan, organizing their thoughts around what they can see, it's way easier to write about that, because, you know, when just as opposed to without thinking.
I think Heddy's made a really, really important point here, and about this think, plan, write need. Just one little thing though, I just think it's super important that we need to make the difference between IELTS Task 1 and IELTS Task 2. Now, I'm already super excited for IELTS Task 2 because there's like so many interesting points coming up already. So that's coming up in a couple of weeks. So please come back for IELTS Part 2 writing. But this is so important. There's nothing subjective about IELTS Task 1, and you must make sure that there is zero critical thinking in IELTS Part 1. This is, so we kind of little bit gone off on a tangent with critical thinking and study skills. But just to rein it back into the session today, which is Task 1, it's very important they do not express any opinion, that they do not make any kind of links with the data, they don't imply any links with the data. It's just invented anyway, so there are no links because it's invented. And if a candidate does that, it's really severely penalized. So this goes back to what I was saying in the workshop and in the first question in task achievement. And it can really, you know, it can really pull the rug out from under people's. I've seen amazing answers, and like the last sentence that will say something like, and in my opinion, this information is completely correct because health is very important. And I just go, because whoosh, you know, and the answer could be perfect. And they are going to go, they've just taken their IELTS and flushed it down the toilet with one sentence. So it's very, very important that there's nothing subjective in Task 1. However, come back for Part 2 and we'll talk about all the subjectivity like. So yeah.
Thank you, Nikki.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for attending.